Welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast, the podcast that explores the issues, stories, and people that have shaped places into what they are today. Here's your host, Adam Kamek.
If you're interested in starting a new website, then get your domain name and web hosting through Bluehost. Bluehost is easy to use, has great customer support, and easily integrates with WordPress, Google Workspace, and numerous other online tools. Plus, if you get your hosting at my link, then you could potentially get your site promoted via this podcast. Get your hosting through Bluehost at placesandprofiles.com/blue. Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Places and Profiles podcast. Today, I'm speaking with Dr. Bill Berry about the history of NASA and the history of the U.S. space program. Bill is former NASA chief historian. He did his doctoral dissertation on the Soviet space program, spent 22 years in the Air Force, and worked at NASA for 20 years. For more information on today's episode, please check out the show notes page at placesandprofiles.com/17. Bill, welcome to the show.
Hi, Adam. I'm very glad to be here.
Well, thank you so much for joining me. I really appreciate it. So since we're taking a look at the history of the U.S. space program and the history of NASA, I figure the appropriate place to start would be with the establishment of NASA and what existed as far as space research in the U.S. prior to NASA. So fill us in there. What did space research in the U.S. look like in the pre-NASA era? And then how did the establishment of NASA come about?
Yeah, well, people have always been interested in space, and a lot of that took the form of astronomy in the old days. People looking through, with their eyes first, and then with telescopes, and so there's always been something. And so in the early 20th century in the United States, there was sort of a combination of academic people who were interested in space or space topics like studying the sun and the solar flux from the sun, for example. There's a big project on that. And looking at the planets, you had academic astronomers looking at the planets, but you also had some sort of dilettante astronomers, with people with lots of money who built their own telescopes, who looked at things like Mars, for example, and Percival Lowell, who built his own observatory, and then pronounced that there were canals on Mars, which is apparently partly a misunderstanding of an Italian translation. But anyway, that's another story. But so there's always been an interest in that. As the 20th century went on, and it became more obvious both to theoreticians who thought about how could we actually get something into space, an instrument, and of course eventually a human maybe into space. It became more apparent that in fact the technology was in fact approaching to be able to do that. And you had early thinkers about rockets in Germany and Russia and in the United States, Robert Goddard, particularly in the United States, who were looking at how would you do this sort of thing, and could you build, for example, a rocket that would get something into space? So there's a lot of work in that direction at that time. And of course, as the post-World War II period happened, you got to see more and more government involvement in that stuff because there were security concerns about that. And so the various, and for example, in the United States, the military services, both the Army and the Air Force and the Navy, were all interested in pursuing things in space and scientific activity as well as potential use of space for defensive purposes. So lots of things happening at the time, but a combination of sort of private people doing space research, academics doing their academic version of space research, and then of course the government involved in its own space research projects. So all that stuff is kind of in the mix. And in the early 1950s, among the scientific community worldwide, a group of scientists decided that they should have what was called the International Geophysical Year, and it's actually a year and a half. But anyway, so from 1957 to halfway through 1958 was supposed to be the International Geophysical Year, and it was modeled on the previous international polar years, where scientists around the world had decided to focus on a set of questions about some particular topic, the Antarctic or the polar regions or whatever it was. And in this case, in the late 50s, they were going to study the geophysical world, the Earth as a large system. And the people who were organizing that project thought that we're close to having the technology for launching a satellite into orbit, and wouldn't it be great to be able to find scientific data about the Earth from space? And so, that ought to be one of our goals. And so at one of the meetings for the organizing the International Geophysical Year, the scientists announced that, in fact, they wanted that to be a goal. And the U.S. scientists said, hey, the United States government has signed up to do this. We're planning on launching a small satellite for scientific purposes during the International Geophysical Year. But the next day, the Soviet delegates at the same convention said, well, we're launching one too. And nobody took the Soviet claim there very seriously. Some of the scientists realized that they were actually actively working on it, but there wasn't a whole lot of expectation that would actually happen. Everybody sort of expected that the U.S. satellite would be the first one in orbit. Now, behind that, there's an interesting backstory on that. Why would the Eisenhower administration, which was not known for spending money frivolously, let's put it that way, why would they back a satellite? Part of the reason was because they were trying to build a satellite that could spy on the Soviet Union. Because the big question that was facing everybody in the U.S. was, do the Soviets have a capability to strike the United States, and what are their capabilities for other things? And the Soviet Union was closed off at that time. It was hard to get information about what was going on. The United States even went to the extent of flying U-2 airplanes, violating Soviet sovereignty and flying over the airspace to take pictures of various things there to find out what was going on. That didn't last very long. Eventually, the Soviets built a surface-to-air missile that could take out a U-2, and they shot one down in the 1960s to the great embarrassment of the Eisenhower administration. But that need for Eisenhower to find out what was really going on, in part because there were so many people in the U.S. who were pushing for a huge arms buildup, and Eisenhower, a military guy, you think, well, he'd be all in favor of that. He actually wasn't. He actually thought that it would bankrupt the country and would, cause people to spend money on things that they didn't need to spend money on, and we really didn't need to. And so he was trying to make sure we had the data to see, did we really need to do something about the Soviet military buildup? Because the Soviets kept saying, we have all these nuclear bombs, we're going to take you out, and they really didn't have the capability to deliver those things anywhere far away, especially not the United States. So the Eisenhower administration's thinking back in the early days, in the early 50s, is, we're going to build ourselves a spy satellite, and what better cover for that than to have a scientific program that we can say, well, it's the things that we're doing here are also part of a scientific program. They wanted a scientific program that was definitely scientific, and they wanted to be able to say that we have a civil space program that's not run by the military, but they're also running this in the background, this intelligence agency effort to build a satellite so they could find out what really was the story on the level of armaments in the Soviet Union. So all that context is sort of playing out as we get into the 1950s.
Right. And on the subject of satellites, of course, the Soviets launching the Sputnik 1 satellite October 4th, 1957 is going to be very significant as we tell the story of NASA and the U.S. space program. So how did the Soviets launching of Sputnik 1 factor in to the establishment and then progression of NASA? And how did the larger space race between the U.S. and the Soviet Union factor into what NASA was doing at this time?
Yeah, well, if it wasn't for Sputnik, there wouldn't be a NASA. Is basically the bottom line, right? The launch of Sputnik, it's interesting because the launch of Sputnik on October 4th, 1957, kind of takes people by surprise. Nobody expected the Soviet Union to be able to do that. I mean, as a country that, 12 years before had just, ended a war where their country had been largely overrun and most of their industry was wiped out in the western part of the Soviet Union. They were victorious on the Eastern Front and helped end that war, but they were in sort of dire position, and they really weren't that advanced a society, at least as far as people were concerned. Anyway, at the time, it'd been really an agrarian, sort of peasant-based society up until the end of the Tsarist era, which is only in 1917, right? And then after the Tsar's overthrown, the Soviets come in, and it's this sort of broad industrialization effort, but it's mainly focused on sort of bringing the Soviet Union into the beginning of the 20th century. So they built steel plants and they make giant agricultural facilities, get rid of independent farmers because that's not focused enough. And so the Soviet Union is sort of seen as a pretty much a backward place, particularly technologically. They're way behind everybody as far as things are concerned, and their effort in World War II seemed to suggest that. Although at the end of the war, they pretty quickly after the war ended, were produced a nuclear weapon of their own, and then almost immediately after the U.S. produced a hydrogen bomb, the thermonuclear bomb in the early 50s, the Soviets exploded one of their own. So it was clear that they could focus on some things and catch up pretty quickly. And there was concern about in the West anyway, and maybe the Soviet system actually works pretty well for these sorts of purposes, for making the society develop quickly and move from kind of a backward position to a positive one. So that's the context of October 4th. Sputnik goes up. It kind of beeps, and a lot of people were interested in it and concerned about it. And the president basically dismisses it, says, "Yeah, well, it's an interesting, congratulations, they did it. They did it before we were planning on doing it, but it's really not that big a deal." It was kind of his perspective on it. Right? Then a month later, on November 3rd, the Soviets launch a dog into space, and suddenly, everybody's agog. It's like, whoa, wait a minute. A month ago they launched the first satellite, which all it did was beep. Now there's a live dog in space. First of all, how did they do that? And number two, what does this mean about what their aspirations are for space? Are they planning on, putting a whole bunch of people in space? They're planning on, populating the moon with good communists out there. There was a song that was very popular in the Soviet Union at the time about, we'll be, eating apples from the orchards on Mars in a few years, and that sort of positive view of how the Soviet system was better than the Western system of government and could be more effective started to have an impact on things. And of course, it also had an impact on politics in the United States, right? What doesn't, right? And much as we might think politics in the United States these days are working in ways that have never happened before, it's really not the case. I mean, our political system has always been sort of adversarial, and people taking advantage of current events to complain about things. Just as in the 1950s, after Sputnik 2 in particular, a guy by the name of Lyndon Johnson, who was the head of the Senate, the Chuck Schumer of his day, I guess. He decides that he's a Democrat. Eisenhower's Republican. He's got to have hearings about this. Why did we fall behind the Soviets, and what's going on? What are we going to do about this thing? And Eisenhower recognizes that this is a serious problem, and so a couple things happen. One, the administration starts thinking about how are we going to organize ourselves to have a space program, and how do we keep that from becoming just a completely military program? Because most of the money that was happening and most of the capability to launch things was in the military. The building ICBMs, long-range rockets to hit the Soviet Union, for example, and so they had the most capability to put things into space, and the military services were anxious to pursue that, and Eisenhower was very wary about that. He doesn't want a whole bunch of money going to the Department of Defense for all these space projects, and so he's starting to think about, well, maybe we ought to create an organization that's separate from that and do our scientific stuff in an organization that's set up to do scientific research on space, and so that's happening at the same time that Eisenhower realizes that he really does need to do something about the things. And so one of the things he does is he goes to the Navy. Now, the Naval Research Laboratory, which is a semi-civilian organization in the Department of Navy, they had gotten the project to build the launch vehicle for Project Vanguard, which was going to be the United States satellite for the International Geophysical Year. And they had a test launch planned for December. And so they're going to do this test launch of the rocket. Well, the Eisenhower folks start leaning on it. Naval Research Laboratory say, "Hey, we really need to step up the game here. Let's do something about this." And so they decided to put this, Vanguard 1 on that rocket, and they're going to try and launch it into space. But they've been, the Naval Research Laboratory is playing as that's like, this is our first try. Don't expect too much. And sure enough, what happens is the rocket lifts off the launch pad about 10 feet and then explodes. And of course, every camera in the country. It wasn't on live TV because they didn't really have live TV at that point in 1957, but it got filmed by all these film cameras. Then it got played on the news everywhere, in newsreels and all kinds of things like that. So everybody saw this explosion of this rocket, and there's pictures of it all over the front pages of the United States. And the satellite itself winds up rolling out into a bush and doing its broadcast. They find it because they find a radio signal. You can actually find that actual satellite, the Vanguard TV3 satellite, is actually on display at the Smithsonian now, all bent up and crumpled. Anyway, so the combination of Sputnik 1, Sputnik 2, and then Vanguard blowing up on a launch pad, things really got crazy in the United States about we need to do something. And so in spring of 1958, there's all this effort to create an organization. Strangely enough, Congress and the president agree that there ought to be, an organization that's a scientific organization to do that. And they settled pretty quickly on the idea that the National Advisory Committee for Aeronautics, right, the NACA, which had been created in 1915. Interestingly enough, in 1915, the United States was actually behind in aircraft technology compared to Europe, and we discovered that when World War I happened, and we wound up having to buy planes from Europe to have our military guys fly over the front in France during World War I. So the United States created the NACA in 1915 because we were behind in space, or behind in aviation technology, and they quickly became the premier worldwide organization. And that's, interestingly enough, and that's another interesting long story about the NACA. But the NACA had, after World War II, become more interested in space and rocket research and high-speed flight. The X-1 program, where the first supersonic flight, was a joint program between the Air Force and NACA. The X-15 program was started in the 1950s by the NACA and the military services working together. And the guy who ran the NACA at the time, a guy by the name of Hugh Dryden, was a very forward-thinking guy. And so gradually through the late 1940s and into the 50s, more and more of what the NACA was doing was more rocket and space research related. And so it became a pretty easy sell when they're looking for an organization, a government organization that can handle research and development on a scientific level for space. The NACA becomes the obvious case. So the administration and the Congress settle on the idea of we'll take the NACA and plus it up to do things. And so they added some other organizations to the NACA. For example, those guys from the Naval Research Laboratory who've been working on Vanguard, they get moved over to the NACA and NASA on October 1st, 1958, when it opens. And they become basically the core of what's now the Goddard Space Flight Center in suburban Maryland. But also a couple of other military projects that were in work get transferred to the new organization, NASA. And then eventually the Jet Propulsion Laboratory, which had been actually a contractor for the Army, doing assorted things, but they were interested in doing space stuff. They get added to NASA, and what becomes the Marshall Space Flight Center in Alabama. Werner von Braun's rocket team, much to the annoyance of the Army, they get dragged away from the Army and handed to NASA as a center there to do large rocket developments and eventually to build the Saturn V rocket for the flight to the moon. So that's sort of the story. In 1958, spring of '58, the government agrees to do this. They quickly push a law through, and it gets signed by the president in July. And on October 1st, 1958, NACA becomes NASA, and these other organizations start to get added to it as time goes along, and they build up the organization.
Well, and then moving forward to 1961, that's when we start actually seeing human beings in space. And the Soviets beat the Americans to space with Yuri Gagarin getting to space. Then we have Alan Shepard becoming a national hero by being the first American in space. A couple years later, John Glenn becomes the first American to orbit the Earth, even though Gagarin had already been the first person to orbit the Earth. And for Glenn and for Shepard, this is happening during Project Mercury. Now, they're probably the two most prominent astronauts who were a part of Project Mercury, but there were seven initial Mercury 7 astronauts. What can you tell us about those people who were astronauts during Project Mercury and about Project Mercury in general and what that project accomplished?
One of the first things that this new organization, NASA, does is it sets up a man in space program, as it was called at the time. And of course, if you're going to put someone in space, you need somebody to put in a space capsule and send it to space. And it's an interesting background story about that because, fall of 1958, I mean, NASA hits the ground running. It's like, okay, we need to get this man in space program going. And it's a very limited program. It was basically a program designed to put a human in space to see, what happens, can they function in space? Because there were, medical doctors who said, zero gravity would, make it impossible for them to swallow, and they won't be able to, eat or drink, and they'll all die if they go into space. Or there were psychologists who were saying, seeing the Earth from outer space will flip people out, and they won't be able to handle it, and they'll all go crazy. And there are all these sorts of crazy theories out there about what would happen. And so NASA's thinking about, okay, how are we going to do this stuff? And so there's bureaucrats in Washington. They sit down like bureaucrats in Washington do, and they try to figure out how we're going to do this. And say, okay, well, we're going to put an advertisement out, and we're going to look for people who are used to being in highly stressful situations where they have to perform. So mountain climbers, deep sea divers, circus performers, even, and there was a whole long list of sort of qualifications that they were looking for. And they were going to put this ad out. And the way the government advertises for jobs is they post it in this document that the government puts out every week or so. And so they have this ad all prepared, and they go to the White House with this thing. They show it to President Eisenhower, and he starts asking a lot of really practical questions, like, okay, what happens when one of them dies? How do we take care of the families? And the guys at NASA go, well, I guess we'll have to have insurance. And he goes, and I sounds like, well, okay, who's going to insure these people? It's a pretty risky business. I guess the government will have to do that. And, so they go through this discussion. Pretty quickly, it becomes apparent that there's a lot of more thinking they need to do about this ad that they were going to put out. And Eisenhower says, finally, we've got people that can solve all these problems for you. We got military test pilots. They're used to flying, in dangerous positions. They're used to, particularly test pilots. A lot of them died in the 50s, right? So they're used to kind of a hazardous lifestyle. They, will do what we tell them to do. The insurance thing's already covered because they're in the military, and they're, basically the military will take care of them and take care of their families afterwards if something happens to them. We don't have to worry about them, blabbing secrets that we don't want the Soviets here because they're all used to having all the security clearances anyway. Why don't you just pick some, test pilots? And the NASA guys go, oh, no, yes, sir. And so they go back and they scrap the whole idea of putting this ad out for astronauts. And they go to this military services and say, okay, we need your best test pilots. And the military services go off and they secretly, talk to the test pilot communities, and they find people and they bring them in for interviews. And originally, several hundred that they identify, and they finally narrow it down. And the plan was to do about a dozen people. When NASA gets down to the interviews and they get to the end of the list there, they realize that they're having a hard time picking people, and say, well, we'll go for 6. And so they're going to hire 6 guys, and then they realized that there was like hard to choose between the ones that they had left, so they wound up with 7. And they become the Mercury 7. And NASA has this press conference to introduce the Mercury 7 to the world, and immediately, people in America go crazy over this. The media goes crazy on it. There's this, the press conference is packed. They had this little tiny auditorium at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. And the places, they had more reporters than I knew what to do with it. And they had them squeezed in. And of course, the astronauts are, they're all, calm, cool, collected test pilot kind of guys. And they're also highly competitive with each other. So they were kind of trying to outdo each other, and they're being both funny and engaging and entertaining, and everybody, so pretty soon people were, following the life of test pilots and astronauts, and they become kind of the national heroes. And it's sort of like, the knights in shining armor, because, we're not in a war with the Soviet Union. We're in this thing called the Cold War, where there aren't any real battles. And so how are you going to, compete against that sort of, how are you going to prove, who's better, or how are you going to score points against each other? And you wind up doing it kind of like knights of old did, where they jousted with each other. or World War One, we had in early days that pilots sort of fighting off to be aces and stuff. And so the astronauts become sort of the heroes of the day who are going to prove that the United States is better than the Soviet Union, and that our system works better, and that we're all American gung ho folks and stuff. So they become everybody's hero. I was one of those guys who was taking that. I was a young kid at the time, and literally my first memory is of watching John Glenn's flight, sitting on the floor in front of our TV at home, because it had a huge impact on me and many of the people I grew up with. Who I don't think I'd met a kid that I went to school with that didn't at one point or another want to be an astronaut, including myself. So the Mercury astronauts become sort of this embody our ambitions about the future. And of course, Alan Shepard being the first to fly on a suborbital flight, he kind of scores the first points there. Kind of a rugged all-American Navy guy, and then John Glenn, who's sort of apple pie mom and Boy Scout kind of guy, gets to be the first to orbit the Earth, and he becomes a big hero as well. But the other astronauts in the Mercury program are all did important things and all flew their flights, except for one, a guy by the name of Deke Slayton, who had a medical problem that grounded him. So very minor heart murmur that the flight surgeons detected. So he actually gets grounded. He actually came off grounding in the mid 70s and actually did get to fly in space on the Apollo Soyuz mission, but he got ruled out in initial days. So there were 6 Mercury flights flown with astronauts on board, and they all extended the range. The first 2 were suborbital, Alan Shepard and then Alan Shepard and then Gus Grissom for the second suborbital flight, and then that's spring and summer of 1961, and then early 1962 John Glenn flies his first orbital flight. And in orbital flights after that got longer and more complex, and led NASA to realize that we're going to need another program here, because by that point President Kennedy was in office and had announced that we were going to the moon, and if we're going to do that, we needed a bigger spacecraft. We needed to learn how to do all these things that you couldn't do with the Mercury capsule. So that's Project Mercury in short form there.
Yeah, so you said then the determination is made that a new program is going to be needed. So we get Project Gemini, and then we get Project Apollo, where we do actually get to the moon. What happens during the Gemini program? Because that one is not as well known as Mercury and Apollo. And then how do we build up to getting the Apollo program and eventually getting to the moon with Apollo 11?
Yeah, Adam, you're exactly right. Nobody remembers Gemini, which is really a shame because it was critical. It was the program where we went from, Mercury proves, guys can go in space, and no, they're not going to go crazy from being in space, and they can eat and drink, and they can actually perform functions. They can fly the spacecraft, and so but they really couldn't do much else. You couldn't really maneuver the spacecraft around. And if we're going to send people to the moon, it was pretty clear we're going to have to get out of the spacecraft and be able to do stuff. And you're going to have to, rendezvous with other spacecraft. Probably, we still hadn't figured out in those early days quite what method we were going to use to get to the moon, but it was pretty clear it was going to involve various things. And we're also going to have to, when you land on the moon, people are going to have to get out of spacecraft to go collect some rocks or whatever it is that they're going to do on the moon, whatever scientific work they're going to do. So you're going to need spacesuits that can function in outer space. And there's all these other things. You're going to need, battery systems that work longer, or some sort of electrical system. You're going to need ways to keep people alive in space for up to 2 weeks at a time. Well, how do you learn how to do all that stuff? You can't do it with a Mercury capsule. So they wind up with what they called Mercury Mark II originally, or the Gemini program. And basically Gemini's the upsized Mercury capsule, much more sophisticated, but bigger, could take 2 people. And that's where we learned all the things we needed to do to be able to get to the moon. Rendezvous and docking, spacewalking. Spacewalking was a lot harder than we found. We found it was a lot harder than we thought it was going to be. And it wasn't until the very end of the program we sort of sorted that out. And developing fuel cells, things that combined hydrogen and oxygen that made water and electricity. That's a pretty handy thing to do. That was the way we were going to, get electricity on the way to the moon. And all kinds of other systems for communications and mission planning. We learned how to run a mission control center, right? Because we had never had one of those before. So we built. There's a small mission control for Mercury, but and I was in Florida at Kennedy, which became Kennedy Space Center. When we built mission control in Houston at what's now the Johnson Space Center, and all that stuff had to be developed, and that was all done during Gemini. And so Gemini is a really, really important program. And the astronauts who flew in Gemini, because of course NASA began to hire more astronauts, they knew they were going to need more for the moon landings. Those guys learn how to do those things in the Gemini program, and those largely the astronauts get hired for Gemini are the ones who wind up going to the moon and leading the moon landing program through those flights.
Well, and then we get the Apollo program. And I guess maybe the way I want to look at the Apollo program is by contrasting disasters and near disasters with tremendous triumphs and successes. Apollo 1, sadly, 3 astronauts perished in an accident connected to that mission. And of course, Apollo 13, because of the movie in the 90s, there was a resurgence over the last few decades. But of course, this was a near tragedy, a near disaster, where fortunately those 3 men were able to survive. But we contrast that with Apollo 11, a tremendous success of having the first men walk on the moon. And there were 5 other missions in which men walked on the moon, culminating in Apollo 17 in 1972, being the most recent manned moon landing 51 years ago. So can you kind of give an overview of the Apollo program and some of the successes and some of the shortcomings and tragedies that are associated with it?
Yeah, boy, Apollo. I could probably talk for several days about Apollo. Actually, I could probably talk several days about anything about space. But anyway, the Apollo program was, of course, launched in 1961. You have to remember, President Kennedy was sworn in January 1961, and he's not well liked in a lot of. It was a pretty close election. Particularly not well liked in Texas, for example. And people were annoyed kind of that Lyndon Johnson wound up being his vice president rather than being the guy on the head of the ticket. But Johnson was very happy that Kennedy put him in charge of the space program because that had been an interest of his. And so he's an important factor in pushing things. And when Kennedy comes into office, he actually he ran on a platform of we're behind the Soviets and what the heck is the Eisenhower administration done? And this guy, Nixon, who he's running against, who had been the vice president under Eisenhower, he's like, he's the blame for the fact that we're behind. And we really need to, do something to speed up our space program. But when he became president, in his inaugural address, he's like he basically tried to end that issue. He says, well, we should actually cooperate with the Russians in space and it'd be better if we didn't spend a lot of money, on big space programs. But then he has a very bad spring. I mean, there's a number of things that go wrong. A couple of his programs that he tries to start don't go very well at the very beginning. There's the Bay of Pigs invasion, which had been planned under the Eisenhower administration, and Kennedy approved, but then didn't back completely, and it was kind of probably a bad idea to start with. So the plan was to free Cuba from Fidel Castro and the proto-communist regime down there. That fails miserably, and then of course, and shortly after that, the Russians launched Yuri Gagarin in an orbit around the Earth, and they have the first human in space. And very clear that the United States had been trying to be the first in space. So Kennedy's got all these headaches. And he's looking for some solution. And one of the things he does is he turns to the Vice President Johnson and says, "What can we do about this? Is there something we could do to end this issue? Because I'm really tired of. I've got other things I want to do as president besides the space program. And can we find something we could do that we can beat the Russians at?" And Johnson goes over to his friends at NASA, and they immediately come back and say, it's going to require, the reason the Russians keep beating us in space is because they had this really big booster rocket that they built because they thought they were going to have a really huge, that their nuclear warheads were going to be really huge. And so they built this really big rocket, which also happened to be a good space launch vehicle. That wasn't a coincidence, by the way. they're going to be able to do a bunch of stuff still. In fact, if you read the declassified intelligence estimates that went to the president during the early 60s, the CIA and other organizations were telling him, Russians are still going to be able to do stuff that we're not going to be able to do yet because they have a bigger rocket than we do. So when NASA's asked, what can we do to beat the Russians? They said, we need to have a goal that's going to require them to build a new big rocket and us to build a new big rocket. And we think we can beat them at that. If we have a fair fight, we'll start this at the same level. We can probably beat them. And the thing that's going to drive that is trying to put humans on the moon. You could probably get humans around the moon with the technology the Soviets currently have. You put one guy in a capsule and zip around the moon and bring it back again. But to get him to land and come back again, that's going to require a really big rocket. And so we got to do that. So Kennedy says, great. And so he gives a speech at the end of May in 1961. The Congress is basically a do-over of his inaugural address, where instead of coming up with the things he had as an argument, he throws a whole bunch of new things on the table. Hey, we ought to create this thing called the Peace Corps, and we ought to do, a supersonic transport program. We ought to have this, that, and the other thing. And one of the things in that list of things is we ought to go land on the moon. Most people forget that speech was about a whole bunch of other things, as well as landing on the moon. But the thing that everybody remembers from it is the moon landing. And once NASA gets that authorization, and Johnson, everybody thought, well, Congress may not buy this. But of course, Vice President Johnson knew how the Senate operated. He knew where everybody's, what the levers were, and he was able to twist arms and, hey, we'll build this in your district and we'll do that stuff. And so the whole idea of landing on the moon just sails through Congress, so hardly any debate at all. And now we're on our way to the moon. So that's where the Apollo program starts from. And it's, of course, now we've got to do it in a decade, is what the president says. And so NASA's under the gun now. Okay, we're going to do all this stuff in space. We have to figure out how we're going to get to the moon. We have to build this giant rocket to get to the moon. We have to do it before the Soviets do. And there's a lot of pressure on NASA to do things. And so NASA's building an organization, and they open up what becomes Kennedy Space Center. The Stennis Space Center, where we tested rocket engines, gets built. Johnson Space Center, which in Houston, Texas, where was originally called the Manned Space Flight Center, where they were going to work on the designs for the spacecraft and have mission control and things like that. All these, so NASA's building up this huge organization, and it's running the Mercury program and building the Gemini program, and we're trying to build this thing called Apollo. That's going to be the mission that sends us to the moon. Huge budget requirements, but also a lot of stuff going on at the same time, and very difficult to manage. I mean, this is huge. By the time we're done, there are 500,000 people, 20,000 different companies in the United States working on the Apollo program. And all that stuff has to sync up and work. And you have to make sure that nothing breaks, because, the millions and millions of pieces of equipment, bits and parts that make up the Saturn V and Apollo rocket that send people to the moon. And any one of those that fails, it could be catastrophic. So there's a huge system created for tracking where things come from and how they're built and organizing the whole thing. And it's really an amazing example of learning how to do a really big project. And in part, NASA drew from whatever experience it could. They poached from the Air Force the guys who run the Minuteman missile program to sort of manage the Apollo program. And so this huge program gets set up. But even so, these guys are working, most of them, 6 days or 7 days a week. For example, at NASA headquarters, the people in the Apollo program during the 60s, they'd work 5 days a week normally, and then Saturdays they'd have their big meetings together. Everybody would come in from around the country. The senior leaders would come in from around the country, and they'd meet on Saturday. And the staff at the headquarters was busily taking notes and sending out memos to people about what was going on and what the decisions were made, and trying to coordinate everything so that we don't wind up with things that don't fit together, or projects that don't work. And have we thought of everything? So in this big rush, the contract for the Apollo capsule goes to a company called North American, later bought by Rockwell, but it's in Southern California, and they hadn't built a spacecraft before. But then again, the Grumman Corporation, which was famous for building airplanes for the Navy, they get the contract to build the spacecraft is going to land on the surface of the moon. And parts of the Saturn V are built by various companies like Chrysler and Boeing and Chrysler, actually the car company, actually they're important. They're the prime contractor for the first stage of the Saturn V. There are all kinds of things going on, and inevitably, in the rush to get things done, things didn't go really well. There were problems with the Apollo capsule, and of course, the crew is trying to make the capsule work for them. The lead crew on Apollo is Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. And Gus, of course, has experience from Mercury and Gemini. Ed White was the first guy to walk in space in the Gemini program, and Roger Chaffee's a new guy. But they're in there at North America on the capsule all the time, and they're saying, well, we could use zero G. We're going to need some Velcro over here to be able to stick things to the wall. And we're going to need some stuff over here. And so they're making minor changes to the capsule. The wiring on the capsule is, constantly being redone to fix things. And so the first capsule that's coming off the line is, Gus Grissom was not real happy with it. And there were some issues. And sure enough, in the rush to do things, they put the capsule on the pad, and they're doing things. They're planning on launching it in a few weeks for the first shakedown flight of an Apollo capsule in Earth orbit. It's just going to go in Earth orbit and check it out. And unfortunately, people just weren't thinking about it, but that they did this what they call a plugs out test, where they basically tested the capsule and the rocket to make sure that everything worked the way it was supposed to. And so they closed the hatch. They put all the pressurized things, and they discovered that when they closed the hatch, sometimes there'd be problems with nitrogen in the capsule. It was supposed to be 100% oxygen interior, because that made it, they could run it at a lower pressure, and so that made it easier on building the spacecraft to operate at a lower pressure. But also meant that you had 100% oxygen air in a highly flammable environment. And in this test, they pressurized the capsule to make sure that there wasn't air flowing into it. And so it's high pressure, 100% oxygen, all this flammable material. And while these guys are sitting on a launch pad trying to sort out things on a very long Friday afternoon, and things aren't going really well, they're having problems with communications with the people on the ground, at the launch site, and a spark happens. Not quite clear where it happened, because the fire was so powerful. It really burned up the entire inside of the capsule, but a spark happens. The crew can't get the hatch open because, ironically, right, when Gus flew his first flight, that suborbital flight, the hatch on his Mercury capsule accidentally blew off. And so the people who are designing Apollo at the time look at that and go, oh, we should make sure we have a hatch that doesn't accidentally blow off. So we'll make it hard, so build a hatch that's, really hard to open. Not thinking that the crew might want to get out in a hurry at some point. And that's exactly what happened. They couldn't get out. And the fire consumes the capsule. And everybody expected that, there might be astronauts that would, die in the course of the Apollo program. But everybody thought it would happen in space. Nobody thought it would happen on this ground test. And this is just as the Apollo program just getting started. So the Apollo 1 fire is a huge gut punch to NASA, just as they're getting ready to fly in space with this new equipment. Fortunately, the president agreed that nobody really knew the system as well as NASA did. They basically let NASA run its own investigation, which is unusual, but nonetheless was highly effective. One of the astronauts that was key in that investigation was Frank Borman, who gave some really brutal testimony, but also very honest testimony to Congress about what had happened and what the faults were and what they were going to do to fix them. And in many ways, helped save the Apollo program from being canceled. Another thing that's playing out here at the same time is that, strangely enough, as the Gemini program had been going on, the Soviets had set all these first. Suddenly, they just kind of vanish. They stopped flying people in space. They did the first spacewalk before the Americans could, but then after that, there's like no Soviet cosmonauts in space for a couple of years. And everybody's sort of scratching their head about, well, maybe they dropped out of the race, or maybe we're just racing ourselves. And there's a lot of rethinking about, do we really need to do Apollo? But President Johnson's like was of the perspective that, President Kennedy told us to do this. This is his legacy, and we're going to make sure we do this. And so, largely because of strong presidential leadership and some very clearly effective work on the part of NASA and its contractors, the Apollo program gets saved, and they redesign major parts of the Apollo capsule. And a year and a half later, they finally launched the first Apollo mission, Apollo 7, as it's numbered. With Wally Schirra as the commander, and they prove that the Apollo capsule works fine. The new improved Apollo capsule works fine. And then there are a couple of suddenly, late 1968, there's a couple of surges of flights that happened in the Apollo program. One of the things that happens is the lunar module, which was supposed to be tested on the next flight, isn't ready yet because the Grumman Corporation is having a hard time getting the thing to meet the weight requirements. And, who's ever built a lunar module before? It was a really hard task. So Grumman's, behind, and not surprisingly, trying to get the thing ready. And so NASA's like, we need to keep flying, and we need to set the pace going. Otherwise, we're not going to get done, because it's now, October 1968 after Apollo 7 flies. And we've got a Saturn V ready to go. We don't have a lunar module. Let's create this new mission. We're going to send the Apollo 8 crew, instead of them testing the lunar module in Earth orbit, we're going to send them around the moon, which has the advantage of actually beating a program that, unbeknownst to most people in the United States, the Soviets are actually planning on sending a crew around the moon on two people on what's now known as a Soyuz capsule, launched it on a proton rocket and sent them around the moon. And they were very close to being able to pull that off. So Apollo 8 actually preempts that. And we have the December, Christmas Eve flight around the moon of Apollo 8 with Frank Borman as the commander on that one, and Jim Lovell and Bill Anders. And Bill Anders, of course, takes the famous Earthrise picture, which has a big impact on things. So the Apollo program suddenly gets off to a rocketing start after this kind of really bad start. They got Apollo 7. A couple months later, you got Apollo 8. A couple months later, they fly Apollo 9, which is the lunar module test, and everything goes perfectly. Right? You would have figured something would go wrong in one of these flights, that there'd be some problems, but everything just basically goes perfectly. So Apollo 8, Apollo 9, lunar module test. Apollo 10 is in May of 1969, and they fly to the moon and basically fly the entire profile except for landing on the moon. In part, they couldn't land on the moon because the lunar module they had was too heavy to be able to get back off the moon. So there wasn't too much worry about them, cheating on that one and landing. So the plan is for Apollo 11 to possibly land on the moon if everything goes right. And for an amazing round of luck, everything does go right in the spring of 1969. And so in July 1969, Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, and Mike Collins climb aboard Apollo 11 and fly to the moon. Neil and Buzz descend to the surface of the moon in the Eagle lunar lander and successfully land on the moon. Spend a couple hours, setting up experiments, collecting samples, talking to the president, because the President Nixon at that point calls them up to tell them what a great job they're doing. They set up a U.S. flag, and then they get back in the capsule and come back home again. And the first human landing on another celestial body is in the history books. With Apollo 11.
Well, and then as we said, there are 5 subsequent moon landings. Of course, Apollo 13, there's the near disaster that fortunately was avoided, and the 3 astronauts were able to return back to Earth safely. But after 1972, it seems like the focus of manned space travel on the part of NASA shifts, whereas maybe in the early portions of NASA's existence, it was about getting men to outer space, and then from there having men get to the moon. After 1972, that seems to not be a focus anymore, at least the moon part. So how does NASA's focus during this time change as we get the Skylab space station, then we get the Space Shuttle, we get the development of the International Space Station later on? How do we see a shift in what NASA is trying to do and trying to accomplish during this time period?
Yeah, well, the important thing to remember about NASA, which some people don't, I remember this. I get people all the time. It's like, well, why didn't NASA do this, or why didn't NASA do that? Well, it's because NASA is a government agency, right? And they do what the Congress funds them to do and what the president tells them to do. And so Through the 1960s, it's very clear we had this goal to get to the moon and the moon landing, and the Apollo program, through Apollo 17, there actually were supposed to be 3 more Apollo landings, and we actually were building Saturn V rockets to do those missions. Those rockets still exist, and they're on display at Kennedy Space Center, Marshall Space Flight Center, and in Houston at the Johnson Space Center, the leftover Saturn Vs. Those missions get canceled because when the Nixon administration came in, President Nixon was very happy about the Apollo program because he comes in like President Kennedy comes in beginning of 1969. He's got this moon landing program, and it's doing great, and it makes the United States look good. He's very happy to take advantage of that to do all kinds of things that political things, international political things that he wants to get done. Neutralizing the Soviet threat a bit, opening to China, doing a bunch of other things that he has in mind, and he's very happy to have a space program do it. But he really wasn't interested in the space program. He really saw it as Kennedy's legacy. And it's interesting to note that during Apollo, President Kennedy was the one who set the Apollo goal, and never once during 1969 did President Nixon ever mention President Kennedy in any speech or discussion about the Apollo program. But that gave no credit whatsoever to Kennedy for setting the goal, which tells you something about sort of his perspective on things. But it was clear that there was going to have to be some decision, big political decision made, because Congress had been funding NASA and the space program and in big ways up until about 1966. But at 1967 or so, it became clear that Congress was not so interested in it. There were other problems. There was, problems with racial issues, the war in Vietnam, poverty in the United States, and spending a lot of money on the space program was kind of not where Congress was leaning. And so the NASA budget actually got cut. And so as we were landing on the moon, it's interesting. In the spring of 1969, the New York Times published an editorial that said, astronauts will land on the moon probably this summer, and it's a dead end because there is no program beyond that. There's no real plan for what we're going to do, which is true. There was, the budget's being cut. 4,000 people a month are being laid off from the space industry during, 1968, 69, and the workforce is shrinking. And there's a big concern about what's going to happen. So when President Nixon comes into office, he's faced with this immediately. He's got this, okay, we're landing on the moon, but what are you going to do next? And so he appoints his vice president, Spiro Agnew, to go off and lead this group, the Space Task Group, to go look at the question of what's next. And Agnew goes over to NASA, and the NASA folks sit him down and say, "Hey, look at all this. We could build a base on the moon. We could go to Mars. We do this, that, and the other thing." And so Agnew writes a Space Task Group report along with the folks from NASA, and they propose 3 plans. One of which is, maximum effort will land on, land on Mars soon in the next, 10, 15 years, and, build a base on the moon and build space stations and do all those stuff. The not so maximum plan is, we'll do those things, but a little bit later. And the sort of cheapo plan that they come up with is, we're going to build a base on the moon and land on Mars, but it's going to be in like 20 years, right? So none of the things were a cutback. They were basically, we're going to take Apollo and apply that to Mars next, which is not what President Nixon had in mind. So President Nixon gets this report in the fall of 1969, and he says, I don't think so. And he just sits on it and doesn't do anything, makes no decision at all about the space program. Meanwhile, NASA's running away. It's like, okay, Apollo 11, Apollo 12, Apollo 13, and they're doing all these missions. After Apollo 13 and the accident of Apollo 13, there actually was the Nixon administration, President Nixon actually considered canceling all the rest of the Apollo missions. He didn't, only because people convinced him that would make it look like we were giving up and it would look bad. And so the remaining Apollo program flies out, but only every 6 months. That's why we wound up in the end of 1972 with the last Apollo flight. The plan had been to fly them much closer together, but because Nixon was worried about what would happen if there's another Apollo 13 and someone actually died, and how bad it would look for him. So he basically was kind of pushing the thing out. It isn't until near the end of the Apollo program, so it's 1971, 72, that Nixon finally realizes he has to make a decision. And part of what drives it is that there's a re-election campaign. Right? So he gets elected in 1968. The next election is in 1972. And in early 1972, he finally decides, I need to make a decision about things. And one of the things that drives his decision is, remember all those jobs I was telling you that they were losing, 4,000 a month for a while there, as the workforce grows from 500,000 down to 100,000 or less. All those high-paying aerospace technology jobs, a lot of them are in California, his home state, Nixon's home state, and also where most of the aerospace industry is. And he realizes that he might lose the election if he can't carry California, his own state. And so he needs to keep those aerospace jobs alive. And so he kind of looks at, they kind of pull out the Space Task Group report, and he kind of takes a look at it and he goes, well, okay, so the Space Task Group report called for landing on Mars. We're not going to do that. Base on the moon. No, we're not going to do that. Space station. No, that's too expensive too. We're not going to do that. NASA had plans to take a leftover part of a Saturn booster and build a temporary space station called Skylab, and that actually goes ahead. But that had already been approved, and it was very much downscaled from what had been planned. But Nixon goes, well, NASA wants to build this thing to fly people back and forth from the Earth up to the space station, call it the Space Shuttle. That I could do because we'll get some nice aerospace jobs going in California. We'll build out in California, and it's not very expensive, and we won't kill the human space, because if you don't build something else besides an Apollo capsule, we're not building any more Apollo capsules. There's going to be no more Americans in space pretty soon. And the Soviets are busy building space stations at this point and setting up long-term stays. And so there's a whole bunch of factors that push Nixon to finally make a decision at the last minute, really in early 1972. And he says, we're going to build a space shuttle. And so we built a space shuttle, the shuttle to what? To nowhere, really, because there was no space station for it to go to. That had been a whole plan for building it. But he's like, well, we're going to do this thing anyway. And the goal was that we're going to build a space shuttle, and it'll make access to space cheap and easy. And he approves the program. And then immediately after the program gets approved by the president, his budget people take a look at it and go, it costs too much money. And they start cutting back the amount of money that's left for NASA to build a space shuttle. And in programs, there's a saying at NASA, you can have, you stay on budget, on time, or you can meet your goals, right? Those three things, pick two, because you're not going to get all three, right? And so what happened was, when the budget got cut, it's like, okay, well, we're going to reduce the capability of the space shuttle. We're going to have to, because we can't do the things we do. And it's going to take longer to build than we planned. So the plan for replacing the Apollo capsule with a space shuttle stretches out into the early 80s. 1981 is the first flight. And of course, its capability is much reduced. And the plans for it being cheap and easy to use all depended on developing technologies that were expensive to develop, and so those got cut from the program. So we wind up with a space shuttle that's not cheap and easy to use, not as safe as we had planned necessarily, and that comes along later than we planned, but an amazing vehicle nonetheless. I mean, nobody has built anything like it since, and it did amazing things. But the space shuttle was really a redirection that was driven by a political decision made by the political authorities in our country, right? The Congress and the president. They're the ones who make the decisions and provide the money from you and me, the taxpayers. So that's why NASA's course gets set on the shuttle. Of course, folks at NASA weren't really happy with that necessarily, and so they kept pushing all along that we need to have a space station for the space shuttle to go to. Right, that's the whole point of having a space shuttle, is to be able to shuttle back and forth to a space station. And they eventually convince, they don't have any luck with President Ford or with President Carter, but they eventually convinced President Reagan in the early 80s that we should build a space station. And much to the chagrin of his advisors, who kept telling him, no, we don't want to give NASA all this money to build a space station, he agrees to do it. In his State of the Union address, makes a comment like President Kennedy says, we're going to build a space station, we're going to do it in 10 years. And the space station program begins. Okay. Did I
Yeah.
cover all that? Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Absolutely. So then how can we describe the legacy of the space shuttle? Because as we were saying with Apollo, you have these tragedies. In the case of the space shuttle, we have the Challenger disaster in 1986, and then more recently the Columbia disaster in 2003. So these tremendously sad tragedies contrasted with tremendous successes. As you said, this program did amazing things. So what were some of the accomplishments during the space shuttle period, and how can we kind of sum up the legacy of this space shuttle program during its 30 or so years in existence?
The space shuttle is probably the most advanced space vehicle that's ever been built. There's a real triumph of engineering skill and technology, and also of operations. I mean, we learned how to do all kinds of things that deploying satellites, bringing satellites back home again and repairing them, launching space observatories. The plan actually in the early days was that the space shuttle was going to replace every other launch vehicle in the United States. If you notice that most of the space shuttle missions have they're labeled STS something or other, STS-1, STS-2, right up to 135. STS stands for Space Transportation System, because it was going to be the space transportation system for the United States. We're just going to get rid of all those expendable launch vehicles because it was going to be so cheap to launch on the shuttle. That was the expectation. It didn't turn out that way. And after the Challenger disaster, it was pretty clear that that was not necessarily a really good plan. We should probably have a backup system, and there are some things that we didn't make sense to launch on the shuttle. But the shuttle program itself was an amazing triumph of gumption and effort, because, like I said, the capabilities of the shuttle were not what had been planned, but constantly, engineering talent at NASA and NASA's contractors looked at ways to improve the shuttle and how to do things with it we never thought we could do, working together with our international partners in Europe and elsewhere, Japan and other places, Canada. The Canadians built a robot arm that worked on the shuttle, and actually did amazing things. But to me, one of the interesting things is that the shuttle program really changed the dynamic of the astronaut corps, because largely it had been in the 1960s. It was test pilots, and there's a certain personality type there that are test pilots. In the shuttle, you're going to have longer missions, and you didn't have to be a test, because you could. You have two pilots. There are two pilot seats in the shuttle, right? The commander and the co-pilot there, but you got other seats there, so you can have people that aren't necessarily pilot astronauts, or specialists in whatever thing. So the idea of a mission specialist was built, and once you do that, it's like, okay, now you're not stuck with that choke point of you have to have gone, you have to have been a military pilot who's gone to test pilot school to become an astronaut. There were a couple of scientist astronauts that were hired by NASA in the 1960s. That didn't actually work out very well, and only one of them ever got to fly to the moon, and that was, of course, Harrison Schmitt, but the other guys who were scientists, astronauts, found pretty quickly that they weren't real welcome in the astronaut corps, and there was a certain cultural personality for test pilots, and a lot of the scientists, astronauts sort of didn't really fit with that very well. But now suddenly you're going to have you're going to need a much bigger astronaut corps. So NASA's going to have to hire a lot of people. So in 1978, we hired 35 new astronauts, the 35 new guys, as they were known, and they could be more diverse. And so suddenly they could be scientists and stuff. So you get the first Asian Americans, you get the first Black Americans, you get the first women astronauts, the first 6 women astronauts get hired in that first class, and suddenly the astronaut corps becomes much more representative of the the American population and the world population, and people can relate to it more, and it opens up, I think, at least mentally, for a lot of people, the idea that, hey, I may be a girl, but I could still be an astronaut, or I may be a Hispanic, a person who's migrant worker working out here in California, but I could be an astronaut someday. And in fact, people like that actually did. That actually happened. So I think it actually diversified the astronaut corps a lot, and the program has benefited greatly from having a much more diverse workforce in the astronaut corps, and that's been a really big thing for NASA, but also for, I think, our country and for the world too, to see that you don't have to be a white male test pilot to be an astronaut to find space.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. Go ahead.
So I was just the shuttle program did both had impacts both engineering wise, science wise, and culturally, both within NASA and I think worldwide. And its impact, we flew the Apollo program for basically 10 years, actually less than 10 years for the Apollo program. But the shuttle program went on for 30, and it's had a much bigger impact, I think, on lots of things. And, culturally and in lots of other ways that have had a huge impact on things. And it allowed us to build the space station that we now have, and accomplish so many other things, and learn to do things that we'd never done before. So what an amazing program. I was very sad to see it end, but then again, as we saw with Challenger and Columbia, it's a very fragile system and very unforgiving of accidents. And there are better ways to get people to and from space, safer ways to get people to and from space, and that's the direction we're going now.
If you're interested in starting a website, then use Bluehost. I use Bluehost for placesandprofiles.com, and it's great. Their customer support is quick, responsive, and helpful, and it works well with WordPress, WooCommerce, Google Workspace, and countless other online tools. As an added bonus, if you get your domain name or hosting through my Bluehost link, then I will mention your website on the show and link to your website on placesandprofiles.com, as long as your website is not inappropriate and is not significantly opposed to my beliefs and values. Check out Bluehost and get your domain name and hosting today by going to placesandprofiles.com/blue. Again, that's placesandprofiles.com/blue. Yeah, so two more questions for you before we wrap up. And I want to go back to something that we discussed earlier, and that is collaboration, or at least rivalry, I guess maybe would be the better word for it, between the Americans and the Soviets. When the Space Shuttle program ends, that's going to bring about a new era of collaboration between the Americans, and then the Soviet Union has collapsed 20 years prior by this point, and the Russians. Now, we've seen some changes over the last few years to this collaboration between the Americans and the Russians, but what insights can you provide on how this relationship shifted from being this Cold War rivalry between the Americans and the Soviets to being more of a collaborative effort between the Americans and the Russians, and now, unfortunately, there have been some turns back in the other direction more recently?
Yeah, sad state of affairs in the world. But if you look back at it, I think that Premier Khrushchev back in the 1957, 58, when he was looking at he had no interest in a space program, but he saw what a huge impact Sputnik had on the United States, and it really put the Soviets on the map in terms of, wow, these guys technologically, they're beating the United States, and he loved that. I mean, that was critical both for political purposes, for his own, internally and externally, with relations with other countries, but also within his own power base in the Soviet Union. That was a critical addition to his portfolio there. But not only did it help with that, but he saw that it had a huge impact on the security of the Soviet Union. Suddenly people were taking it more seriously, and countries around the world were looking at the Soviet Union and said, "Hey, they were backward at the early part of the 20th century, and now they're beating the U.S. They must know something." Right? And suddenly the appeal of the socialist system becomes much higher, and countries in what was known at the time as the Third World suddenly started turning toward the Soviet Union and taking more interest in partnering with them, which made the United States very nervous. And that's part of the reason why we launched the Apollo program, was to prove, in fact, that the Western capitalist model of government actually works better than the Soviet system, which it does. But anyway, but that was not a foregone conclusion in the early 1960s, when the Soviets were time after time beating the United States at things. And how did they do that? Well, they planned. The Soviets were watching what the United States was doing, and they would very carefully look at what we're doing and say, okay, which of these things that the United States is doing can we do before them? And their space program was really very thin. They had a brilliant bunch of engineers led by a guy named Sergei Korolev, who were really good at things, but it was a really small group, and they didn't have they didn't have a lot of resources. They had all the resources that they had available in the Soviet system because they got top priority when they came up with something. But their basic mission at that point was find something we can rub in the Americans' faces. So the Americans are planning to launch a man in space with this Mercury program. We'll get our guy in space first, and they did. Right, and the Americans are sending a probe to the moon. Well, we'll launch that first. They tried to beat us to Venus. Actually, they put a huge effort in the summer of 1962, I think it was, to try and send a probe to Venus. And they failed on like 3 successive launches. And so Mariner, the Mariner probe that the United States launched becomes the first probe to go to Venus, but not because the Soviets didn't try. A couple of years into the human spaceflight program, there's controversy in the United States about how come these women that took the Mercury astronaut test, the so-called Mercury 13, how come they can't be astronauts? Why do you have to be a test pilot to be an astronaut? Well, the reason for that is because that's what President Eisenhower said, right? That's the reason that happened. But nonetheless, it was a good question, and it was very embarrassing. And NASA wound up taking some real heat on that, and the administration. So 6 months later, what did the Soviets do? They put a woman in space. They had no plans on having women astronauts or cosmonauts, right? In fact, Valentina Tereshkova gets sidelined pretty quickly, and the other women that were her backups, and it's pretty clear they're not going to fly ever again. But nonetheless, it was a huge propaganda coup for the so their program is really driven by those beating the United States. And when they start being unable to do that, that's when the program sort of stumbles. Also, it doesn't help that Sergei Korolev, their genius behind the program, died in 1966. But that's the dynamic of the race. In the United States, at the time, in the early 60s, even actually in the late 50s under President Eisenhower, the United States was trying to get the Soviets to cooperate so that, learn more about what they're up to, but also so that we don't have this expensive space race dynamic going on. But the Soviets aren't interested because they're scoring all these propaganda points by by beating the United States. They're not interested in cooperating. So in 1962, at one point, President Kennedy writes to Khrushchev and says, "Hey, we should have an agreement to cooperate in space." And Khrushchev's not really very interested in cooperating, but eventually, at some point, he agrees to do it. And actually, the first agreement between the Soviet Union and the United States on space cooperation actually gets signed in 1962. It was very limited. It was about sharing weather satellite data and a couple of communications satellite experiments, and it didn't pay off very well. The Soviets weren't able to deliver on things, but nonetheless, the door was open. And the sort of the formula for how would you cooperate, basically setting up these groups of scientists and engineers that would talk to each other, and then they would bring things to their political leaders, and the political leaders would agree or not agree on what to do. That dynamic was still there and set up, and there's some collaboration that happened in the 60s, very, very low level. Astronauts and cosmonauts would occasionally meet each other at like the Paris Air Show and places, and they actually talked to each other and had a fairly good relationship. But it isn't until President Nixon comes in 1972 and decides to do a package of agreements with the Soviets that start what's called détente, the period of reduced tensions. And then we agree to do the Apollo-Soyuz program. Interestingly enough, partly driven by a movie called Marooned, where this fictional story where an American astronaut gets actually saved by a Soviet space crew, and people on both sides see the movie and go, that's a pretty good idea. We should be able to do that. And that's part of the thing that drove the idea of Apollo-Soyuz and the idea of having a joint docking together. That happens, and then immediately after Apollo-Soyuz, things in détente don't go so well in the late 70s. By this time, President Ford is in charge, and then the Soviets invade Afghanistan. Another interesting invasion of Afghanistan in history, and things sour pretty quickly. And so the amount of collaboration gets cut back. But then, as we go through the Reagan years and the space shuttle gets built, and we're doing more active stuff, and Gorbachev comes in the Soviet Union, and that opens up the idea of glasnost or openness, and as an opening that maybe we can have some more collaboration with between the Soviet Union and the United States. So there is some early steps in the very late 1980s to do some collaboration in space. There's talk about flying the shuttle up to the dock with one of the Salyut space stations, or maybe having a Russian or Soviet at the time fly on the space shuttle. That stuff sort of is percolating along, and then the Soviet Union collapses in 1992, and suddenly their space program doesn't have any money to do anything anymore. It's a very low priority. The new leadership of Russia, Boris Yeltsin in particular, has no interest in the space program, because the space program was really kind of a thing for the Communist Party. He doesn't like the Communist Party, so he's like, I'm not interested in that. But he finds out that the Americans are actually interested in collaborating on space stuff, and so he agrees to do it. And part of the reason the United States is interested in collaborating is because there are all these rocket scientists in the Soviet Union, now Russia, and they're unemployed. And we're worried about them going to places like Iran or North Korea and teaching those people how to build missiles that can hit the United States. And so the United States is very interested in keeping the knowledge base of the space program and missile programs intact in the Soviet Union, and not know that knowledge proliferate into places where it could be dangerous. So the idea of collaborating in space becomes a much bigger idea. People in Congress think, yeah, this is a good idea. We like this idea. And at the same time, the space station program, remember I said the president wanted to build it in 10 years. It was pretty clear it wasn't going to get built in 10 years. The space station program was having to constantly get cut back and redesigned. And the program almost got killed by Congress. It came down to one vote in Congress, and the program was only saved by, interestingly enough, Congressman John Lewis, who voted in favor of the space station program to keep it alive at the last minute. And then the next year was a new NASA administrator and a new administration in the United States, President Clinton. The idea comes that we'll take our space station program and the Soviets' plans for what they're going to call Mir 2, and we'll kind of merge those things together and build one space station program, and that becomes the International Space Station, which it gets redesigned in the 1990s and renegotiated because we already had an agreement with a bunch of our partners, the Europeans and the Japanese and the Canadians particularly, to build the space station. So we have to bring the Russians in as partners. The Russians, of course, can't afford to do most of the stuff that they'd like to do, so there's lots of questions about money and schedules get delayed. But nonetheless, eventually the space station program gets launched into space in the late 90s, and is a pretty big success in terms of being able to actually build something internationally, a huge project, probably the biggest international engineering project ever undertaken, and it goes pretty smoothly considering. I mean, there are delays when the shuttle gets grounded, and there are delays when the Russians can't come up with the money to do things, and there are other problems. But the program actually works pretty well, and not only did they build a space station, but while they're building the space station, it's a laboratory in space, they're already using it for space research. Not much at the beginning, but over time they eventually get the thing built, and that's where that brings us to today. Now, both sides, in terms of the U.S. and Russia, have invested huge amounts of money in that, and would both take a really big hit in terms of our capabilities in space if we just ended the space station program. And we can't just we can't just separate them. The space station was intentionally built that it has to work together. The Soviet or the Russian side provides certain things that the system needs, and on the American side, we provide things that the Russians don't provide. And there's lots of overlap on those things, and so we actually have to. The space station doesn't work without a collaboration like that. And if we try to separate apart, it wouldn't really, the whole system would basically fall apart. So both sides are interested in keeping it going. It's hard to do under the current circumstances, but a political decision has been made on both sides, frankly, to sort of set that thing off as a separate political issue and not argue about the space station and let that program continue to run. Other than a head of Roscosmos that was kind of annoying, that eventually he got the axe a couple years back, and he was using it for some pretty serious propaganda issues there. But now that he's kind of out of the way, that things are fairly smooth. And the collaboration continues on, and astronauts and cosmonauts work in space every day. They get along. I understand that they don't talk much about politics. From my astronaut friends that I know, that's what they tell me. But but nonetheless, they have to live and work together, and so they do, and things work out pretty well. On an engineering level, engineers in the United States and scientists in the United States, work closely with our Russian colleagues through mission control and make the space station work. And it looks like we're going to be up there probably till the Russians have committed to 2028 now, and it looks like they're willing to go beyond that. The United States is saying we're going to go to 2030, and at that point, the space station is going to be pretty old. It was only built to last for 15 years. By that point, it'll have been up like 30 years. So it's already going to be like twice of its design life. And so it's going to be time to replace it with something else. And the plan is for the United States to rely on commercially provided space station platforms, which it looks like they're actually being designed and developed, and do that, do our space research in Earth orbit on those sorts of facilities. And then we're going to concentrate on, getting to the moon and setting up, a longer range space program so it can go to the moon and onto Mars. Because if you're busy spending most of NASA's budget every year running the space station, you don't have the money to do other things like go back to the moon or, go onto Mars. So that's the plan with the changing space industrial dynamic, particularly in the United States, where you've got companies like SpaceX and Blue Origin and those sorts of things, where they're seriously building space hardware that has multiple uses, not just government, taxpayer paid for activities, but also things that commercial companies are paying for. We're seeing a real change in the industrial relationship, and I think that that's good for our future in space.
Well, yeah, and that's where I want to wrap up with my final question. So you mentioned SpaceX and Blue Origin there, and this increasing role, this growing role of private companies in U.S. space travel and exploration. You mentioned the continuation of the space station, at least for the next few more years. You also mentioned potentially returning to the moon and looking to take humans to Mars. And we see that with the Artemis program and efforts to build or the Orion spacecraft. So what are some of the key things that you see as we look to the future and as we look to sort of the next generation, the next couple of decades of space travel and space exploration, and what NASA's role will be over the next couple of decades?
Yeah, to some extent, I think that the NASA's, if you could say it has an interest, the interest of people who work at NASA anyway, is to kind of go back to being an R&D organization that does the hard things in space. During the shuttle period, NASA wound up becoming the operator of what was planned to be the nation's space transportation system, and yeah, you can do that, but that was really kind of not what NASA was created to do. It was designed to, as in the case of the NAC, its predecessor organization, the goal was to advance the technology and provide, the capability for advances in science and technology, so that we could do, other things, and operating the bus that brings you up to Earth orbit is really not that. So I think a lot of people at NASA are excited and interested in moving back to a situation where NASA's money and efforts and focus is on cutting edge things like getting people to the moon again, and building a base on the moon, and eventually heading out to Mars and doing pioneering space research with the James Webb Space Telescope and other cutting edge space technologies, satellites and space probes of various sorts. Sending a probe out to a metal asteroid like we launched just recently. So there's that sort of thing. I think is what NASA really wants to do, and that's where we're heading. It was hard to. It would have been hard to do that in the 80s or the 90s when really the industrial base wasn't there. Right? And it's only in the last 20 years or so that we've gotten to the point where space industry is able to do things. There's a market, right? Because the only real market really for space business for many years was really communication satellites. They popped out in the 1960s, and a lot of money went into improving telecommunications via space, with satellites, and that was a pretty lucrative business. But most of the other sectors never took off. Looking at the Earth and the Earth resources satellites, that wound up being kind of a government function. Getting things back and forth to space, that continued to be a government function because it was expensive and hard to do. Any number of other things that you could do in space really didn't happen. And a lot of the problem was driven by the fact that it was so expensive to get stuff into space and difficult. You had to find a launch vehicle, you had to get the government to approve it, you had to do all sorts of stuff like that. And so that was a real constraint on things. But in the early 2000s, step back to the 80s and 90s, people were saying, NASA's a big behemoth organization that's kind of run its course and it can't do its job anymore, and it just should just get out of the way, and we should have private industry do this stuff, which is a reasonable criticism to some extent, and something that would have been nice to happen, but it didn't happen at that time. There were number of countries or companies that were created in the 80s and 90s that tried to sort of become the new space industry of its time, and that just didn't gel. Those things, the business cases didn't close, or the technology didn't work as well as they hoped. There were some notable successes like Space Hab and things like that, but it was limited. It's only in the early 2000s when sort of the teeter totter tips over, and suddenly there is. The technology is there. People learn how to do things. There are companies that do things, SpaceX in particular, but also other companies that came out of the space industry. And NASA intentionally made that happen, I think, because Mike Griffin was the NASA administrator in the the mid 2000s there, and I think he got tired of people coming and saying, NASA just should get out of the way and we should do things. He finally said, okay. Prove it. He said, I'm gonna here's a contract. If you can deliver cargo to the space station for us, we will pay you to do that. So here's the business case. That you close the business case. Investors will now know that they can have a payoff in the end, right? And not only will we give you that contract at the end, but we're going to give you seed money at the beginning. And if you meet these milestones, if you can launch a rocket, if you can successfully orbit the Earth, you can do this. There's milestones that were set up. We'll give you these chunks of money that will help you develop these rockets and move ahead. And SpaceX survived on that. A couple other companies tried and failed, but eventually the Antares launch vehicle was built by Orbital Science Corporation, and as a competitor, and that's now owned by Northrop Grumman. But those that industry was basically fostered by NASA, and it worked. A lot of people at NASA were kind of like, I don't think this is going to really work. We tried it in the 80s and the 90s and it didn't really work. But sure enough, in the 2000s, it actually did work. And so SpaceX and then Orbital and now Northrop Grumman started delivering cargo, and so then NASA said, well, okay, if you can deliver cargo, how about people? And so the crew part of that contract came out, and so now we have an infrastructure out there that can get payloads to orbit relatively cheaply, and they have a business case where they've got a government contract at the end that helps them, kind of pay the bills, but they can also sell that capability to others, and so now we have that infrastructure to do it. So NASA can now say, okay, Earth orbit, we'll buy that service. Cargo to Earth orbit, humans to Earth orbit, will buy that service, and now we can, instead of spending money on getting people back and forth to low Earth orbit or building space stations, we can go back to the moon, and we take our budget, much as it is, it's half a penny of every dollar of the U.S. budget, by the way, and we can do that and do other things with that. And so I think we're really kind of at this dawning age. It was funny when we grounded the shuttle program in the early 20-teens, and a lot of people were like, oh, the space program is over, and a lot of people at NASA were like, just wait. We're almost there. We're almost there. Once these guys from SpaceX and Northrop Grumman out and Blue Origin, those other companies, they're almost there. And sure enough, now here we are in the 2020s, and we're there. We're seeing private industry taking people up into space, bringing them to the space station. We're seeing the space stations being planned from private companies. We're seeing the Artemis program getting off the ground finally, and they're talking about landing a crew on the south pole of the moon in 2025. I think that's probably still pretty optimistic, but nonetheless, they're going to do it with a launch, or a landing vehicle built by SpaceX is the plan at the moment. The SpaceX Starship is going to be the way, the new lunar module of the future, and we're going to buy that service from SpaceX. So I think we're really at the future's so bright. I want to get my sunglasses out and put them on, because I think there's a lot that's going to happen, and I think people just haven't kind of caught up with the idea that the space program is dead because the space shuttle program has ended, and they haven't realized how much things have changed in just the last 10 years alone. And I think we got a really bright future ahead of us, assuming that we can, continue to afford to pay for the things that we're doing, and all the other, political ramifications and that we have to worry about from day to day. But from a technical perspective, I think NASA's got a really bright and promising future doing the things that they'd like to do, and almost makes me wish I didn't retire 3 years ago.
All right. Well, it's nice to end with some optimism. So I'm glad that we could do that today. And Bill, thank you so much for being so generous with your time and joining me here for today's episode. If someone wants to learn more about your work or about the sorts of topics that we've been discussing today, where would you direct them? What would you recommend they take a look at?
Oh, well, I'm on LinkedIn, I suppose, is the only social media thing I'm on. I'm doing a lot of research and writing on historical topics that is still not yet, out yet there yet, but it'll be coming soon. So keep an eye out for books and articles that I'll be writing, particularly about U.S.-Soviet competition and collaboration during the Cold War. That's kind of my thing these days. Or you could just Google me and you can find, I do a lot of public speaking, like, podcasts and things. So you can find me lots of places, like right here.
All right. Yes. And again, thank you so much for coming here today. Again, the show notes page for today's episode is placesandprofiles.com/17. So I want to direct everyone to that website that will have links and resources related to today's episode. So placesandprofiles.com/17. And again, Bill, thank you for joining me today. And I know we went over time, but I thought this was great information. So I appreciate your generosity as far as the time goes, and your generosity for joining me in the first place. So thank you so much for joining me to be able to take a look at the history of NASA and the significance of NASA and the U.S. space program. So thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
It was really my pleasure, Adam. Thanks.
All right. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to today's episode of the Places and Profiles podcast. Please visit placesandprofiles.com to subscribe and listen to more episodes. Come back again soon, and thanks for listening.